Tranquilandia, the biggest lab seizure in the world, was seized 12.5 tons of coke, and nobody knew it was there. It was in the jungle underneath the canopy. They had some transponders, some trackers, and some chemicals. So the chemicals had a transponder, and they tracked it into the middle of the Amazon jungle, and nobody knew there was anything down there. They gave the information to the Colombian cops, and they went out and raided it. And it turned out that FARC, the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, were a guerrilla group that was trying to overthrow the government, were actually protecting the cartel's cocaine investments. It's been an experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything. You know, ups, downs, whatever. Man. But yeah, that one was one, like I say, that didn't give me the humanizing. There was a deal in Spokane, just kind of an off-the-track thing, where there was a guy I got information was dealing speed, meth, whatever. He was a bartender. So I started hanging out in the bar. I got tight with him. And pretty soon, he invites me out to the racetrack. They had a racetrack in Spokane. And I'd never been to a horse race in my life. I didn't know anything about it. So it was like a steep learning curve, trying to, you know, ingratiate myself with him because he took me with his family, his mother, and I think a sibling or somebody, and they had a box. They had a box at the races. And I go, oh, okay, this is a whole new deal. So I'm out there, and he's walking me through the steps on how to place a bet. I'm placing a $2 bet on a horse in Spokane, Washington, for crying out loud, you know. And I'm, okay, and he gives me the list of the runners, the horses, and I picked this one out called Agent's Choice. That was the name of the horse. And that's the only reason I picked Agent's Choice. I'll never forget it. All these other, and they had he's trying to talk to me about the odds and, you know, yeah, this one, mud. He's going all down the handicapping stuff. And Agent's Choice. I'll put my money on Agent's Choice. The damn horse won.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And it was the only time I'd ever gone to a horse race, because when that happened, the feeling of winning, it hit me, and I thought, this could be dangerous.
Yeah, that can go back.
This could be dangerous. Yeah. I'm not going to horse races because I like this feeling. So I never went back to another horse race.
Did you ever, I mean, I guess there might not always be retrospective with, you know, people when you're working cases like that, but I mean, like that moment, hell, if I'm him, I would have like looked at that and been like, wait a minute. You know, is there ever any retrospectives like that with, you know, where you get to talk to them after and stuff, or?
There was one, and I think it's in the book. There were maybe more than one, but the one I remember is that one with the medical doctor in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And the one acquittal that I had, the guy was a manager of a racket club and all this kind of stuff. They were dealing coke from Mexico to Vegas to Spokane, Missoula, Billings, all that. And after the trial, it was a 2-week trial in Missoula, Montana, and he was the only acquittal that I think I ever had in my whole career. And the jury just couldn't bring themselves to convict him because he was smart enough not to meet with me.
Yeah, it wasn't all the messages
telephone.
relayed.
I talked to him on the phone. I met his underlings. I met the guy above him, but he kept in the shadows. And I never had a face-to-face. I could never get him on tape. I got him on a phone call, recorded multiple phone calls. But he was acquitted. They couldn't find probable cause. And after that, I ran into him one day in Missoula, Montana, and we talked. And I asked him, I said, you know, when you had this meeting and you were talking to these guys on such and such a date, if we'd had a recording on you, do you think that you would have been convicted? And he kind of thought about it for a second. He says, yeah, probably. Yeah, I think so. So, you know, but as far as going into depth and really sitting down with people, not so much. There were a couple, but.
Did you feel like there was hard feelings in that situation, or is it kind of just he knows you guys are playing a game almost?
That's interesting. Interesting question, because in those days, for the most part, no hard feelings. I played the game, I lost. Okay, you did your job, you got me. And that was the attitude. It wasn't like now. It wasn't like, My God. I mean, they're targeting cops just because they wear a uniform and things like that. It would scare me to death if my kids or grandkids, God forbid, were going to go into law enforcement. It really would. And you see it in statistics. I heard just yesterday that something like a 40% drop just locally. It was Prince William County or one of the county police departments. They were talking about a drop in applications. Well, you can't blame them. I mean, with what's going on. But in those days, that's why I think those in my peer group had the best of the best.
Yeah.
You know, to be ripping and running, law enforcement, undercover, stuff like that. We had a lot to do. We had a lot of great targets. We had a lot of great successes, some failures, learning experiences. But it was, for the most part, there were exceptions. There were guys that were just, you know, whack jobs. They'd kill you if they could. But for the most part, it was, like you say, kind of a game.
Yeah. It feels like, too, the money was there, but the money wasn't what it is today, where you get, you know, what, a cartel like Sinaloa is bringing in.
Yeah.
They don't play games.
The whole viciousness that started with that, with the Escobars and the, you know, Ochoas and all that stuff came to life. I mean, that's,
We'll get to that here in a second, but because I do want to jump into, you know, going through into the, changing out with the DEA where you're moving down towards Colombia. But there's a key part that we've talked about a few times here where you were able to meet your wife after moving to start learning Spanish. So I guess talk about that first day where you're entering in and you get to see somebody, you know, going on that elevator, get to say a little hello.
Yeah, that was great because I've been going through some stuff, some personal stuff in Spokane, then El Paso, Texas for a couple of years. And when I got selected for Bogotá, he sent me here to Roslyn to language school. It was right a couple of blocks from here.
Yeah, I actually right.
Yeah, it's right over there. And so when I went into school, there's one other DEA agent that I knew of and met immediately. A guy from Orlando was going to Barranquilla, Colombia, the North Coast. And he was 2 or 3 weeks ahead of me in the language school. So he was getting me situated. And one of the things he did was he introduced me to one of the instructors. And he introduced me to her and said, her name is Jenny. And he said, yeah, she's from Bolivia or Belgium or he says, someplace with a B. And she got really incensed. She looked at him, she says, I'm from Bulgaria. And about that time, as you say, she got in an elevator, the elevator doors were closing. She says, nice to meet you. I said, maybe we can have lunch sometime.
Yep, it was a good move.
Maybe. And we had lunch. It turned out that she was the youngest senior instructor to be hired by the Department of State for the Bulgarian language services in their what they call the Foreign Service Institute, FSI at the time. And they had all the language teachers, area studies, all that kind of stuff. And she had defected from Bulgaria, spent a couple of years in Germany, then came to the United States, and subsequently became hired. I mean, she became a State Department employee, and she just rocketed.
It has to be a critical, at that time, program,
absolutely.
too, right? Because we had so many operations
Cold
going that
War.
way.
I mean, you had, right here in Roslyn, you had all kinds of 3-letter agencies operating under, other acronyms and so forth and so on. And she was offered a couple of different jobs to lure her away from the State Department, very honestly. And her parents were still in Sofia, Bulgaria. And she was afraid that if she got involved in something more, covert or that type of thing, it would not be good for her folks if she was ever discovered. So, she stuck with State Department until I convinced her to make a trip.
Yep, and then
promised to show her the world and took her to Bogotá, Colombia.
At that point, so obviously Bogotá was it was still Bogotá, but what was the feeling when you had committed? We're going down to Bogotá, Colombia.
I had applied that year, it was 1982, and I decided I had to get out of El Paso, Texas. I'd done a couple of years there in the intelligence center. And I applied for overseas because I figured, okay, I was financially hurting. I'd gone through a divorce. I was hurting financially. I was hurting psychologically. A bunch of stuff was going on. So I thought, okay, if I go overseas, I can maybe fix things financially. You get danger pay, you get post-differential pay, you get all these extra financial perks so I can pay my bills, get my house in order. And at the time, I applied, I think there were like 13 jobs that were available that I was eligible to apply for. I applied for 11 of them. Japan, South America, Asia, all Europe, all over the place, including Bogotá. And I got selected for Bogotá. The two I didn't apply for were in South Asia, Karachi, Pakistan, and New Delhi, India. I said, I don't think so. So I get selected for Bogotá. And at the time, Bogotá was probably the most dangerous overseas post for DEA.
So it was really hot at that point.
Yeah, it was. Things were bad. But I was single. I'd been living the life. I'd been making my stories and doing all this thing. It was great. But then when I met Ginny, my current wife, and we got married, this whole situation changed because in the interim, from the time I was initially divorced and had the two daughters, I remarried in Spokane, had a son. We were divorced, and that's what led me to El Paso or vice versa. But anyhow, the son was living with his mother. And while I was at language school, she was murdered. So I became like a single father. But I was still in school, and he was with grandparents in Spokane. So the bottom line is when Ginny and I got married, then my son from the previous marriage came, and the three of us, he was not quite 3 years old, and the three of us went to Bogotá. So the whole dynamic was completely different. It wasn't me going down there as a single DEA agent going to save the world and, infiltrate cartels and everything. It was all of a sudden I was a family guy. I had a small child and a wife, and it changed a lot of the dynamics. And unfortunately, I still had that attitude where I'm ripping and running.
You got to get in the stories, yeah.
Yeah, and I just I credit my wife for putting up with a lot.
I got to give her a massive kudos too. With I didn't want to dive as much into the obviously the tragedy that happened that kind of led to culmination of the situation, but the fact that she stepped up so well too with the son was amazing. Seeing that, and in the midst of that, going to Bogotá, Colombia of all spots.
She was a multi-language speaker. She spoke 3 or 4 languages, but Spanish was not one of them. And she had this, I can get by, and she got down there, and it was a totally different world than what she'd come from and experienced. And then she said, maybe I should have listened to some of my colleagues who offered to give me Spanish lessons on the side. Well, we're still there. But she took some lessons in the embassy, and she really stepped up. She's my idol, really.
It's amazing, surely. So suddenly the situation changes. You're going to Bogotá. What were your initial thoughts where you're saying, all this kind of accumulates, you're leaving here in a couple weeks, you guys are going down now as a family. What was the feeling, the psychological shift there with everything happening and also knowing that you're going to spot number one?
It was, for not the first time in my life, it was overwhelming, but probably more so and more legitimately overwhelming than before. And I was just hoping and praying that she wasn't going to bail on me. She would have been totally justified to turn around and come right back up here because they would have held her job. There's no question. She could have walked right back into her office, and I just, like I say, I don't want to beat the drum too much, but I just can't say enough about her. I got down there, and one of the disadvantages was from meeting her was I didn't pay all that much attention in Spanish language. So I barely squeaked through my finals on the language school. You have to have a certain level. Like if they grade them on maybe a 5-point scale. So a 5 is a native speaker at the highest level, the command of the language. I mean, like a scientist or like, someone who's really up on language. A 4, native speaker, or a very good adapted speaker, that can speak professionally. A 3 is a good working knowledge. 2 is minimum to get by. If you got less than a 2, you weren't going.
Yeah, they weren't going to let you go.
They weren't going to go. And I think I got out with a 2. It subsequently went up 2 plus 3, something like that, once I got in the area and using it. But I was trying to learn Bulgarian at the same time.
Yeah.
I had vested interest. So, I got down there, and my Spanish wasn't all that great, but I immediately got in with the cops.
So your first couple months down there, what was the feeling? You're a long way from Spokane, Washington. You're in the hotspot of hotspots. You have rising narcos there. I'm not sure at this point I know a lot of the missions worked around Pablo and Ochoa. Oh my God, Ochoa.
Yeah.
Can never say the name. Both of them. Were they on the radar fully at this point?
Yeah. Oh yeah. As a matter of fact, within the first year, when I arrived, we had 4 offices in Colombia. We had Bogotá in the capital. We had Barranquilla on the north coast. We had Medellín, which was the home, of course, of the Medellin Cartel. And we had Cali, which was a hangout for like the Ochoas, and they had different geographic areas. We had to close all those other 3 offices and bring all the personnel into Bogotá.
Because they had just gotten
because
so
of the
violent.
threats, because of the violence, because of the threats. Yeah. So it was a consolidation of the manpower and woman power into Bogotá within the first year.
So when you're down there, those first initial months, what was kind of that, we're not in Kansas moment anymore, where you're looking around and you're seeing just how serious the situation had really gotten on the ground?
I loved it.
You loved it?
It was cool. And it was unfortunate that I really did. I thought, this is great.
Yeah.
This is great stuff. I was going out with the cops. I'd be the only gringo on most of the missions I went on, And we'd go out and blow things up and burn up coca labs and do all this kind of stuff. And I had a lot of fun. And I didn't take into account the toll on my wife and child because they were restricted. I mean, they couldn't even go around the city. We, the agents, had armored cars. They finally armor plated our cars. And we had weapons. And we had freewheeling for the most part. But the family members, the dependents, they couldn't go to a video store to get a videotape. They couldn't go to a grocery store. They couldn't go anywhere without an armored security guard with a chase car or something like that. They had little vans, these mini vans that were armored with guardaespaldas, bodyguards, guys with, machine guns, shotguns, stuff like that. So it was very restrictive. Before we went down there, we bought a brand new little Honda Civic, and we took it down there. The second year, it never came out of the garage. We couldn't drive it anywhere. The first year was great because we were exploring. We drove all over. We went to a place, the salt mines. They had this famous salt mines cathedral in Zipaquirá outside of Bogotá. They had another little town, Sopo, where we'd go and get fresh strawberries and cream and stuff like this. And we'd explore. We'd go around. And then it got worse and worse and more restrictive. So the travel kind of stopped. About 4 months into it, I went on a trip with the Colombian cops down outside of Cali, Parera, Carlos Lader's hometown in Cali, in that area, looking for a lab, a coke lab. We never found the lab, but that was a wake-up call too, because we had a couple of cars of cops, and I had a 9mm Browning on me, and the cops all had these shoulder bags and stuff like that. But we're going down a little rutted road looking for this coca cultivation and the lab. And I was thinking, you know, we don't know who's going to be there at the other end of this road. And we don't know. I got a little apprehensive. I'm thinking, well, you know, this could be trouble. And then one of the guys said something, yelled out something in Spanish, and everybody comes out with these Mac submachine gun, Mac 10 machine guns and stuff. I'm going, I'm sitting here with a 9mm Browning, and these guys all have machine guns and stuff. I go, whoa. And that, we didn't find the lab. So once again, it didn't turn into anything. But yeah, that one was one of the first experiences in Colombia that kind of rang my bell a little bit and said, this isn't all fun and games.
So, and I want to cover Kiki because, you know, obviously you had an interaction there and his story is pretty relevant just to the whole kind of general diagnosis of everything. But, and, you know, that kind of tails into something later. But so how often were agents finding them or their family kind of finding themselves in kind of direct confrontation? So maybe not in a situation, you know, if you guys are out with the military, but like the family actually maybe being targeted or agents specifically being targeted. Like what was I guess, like how were the narcos operating around that?
At that point in time, in 83, 84, when I was down there, I went down there in April of 83, was there for 2 years until May of 85. 83 and into early 84, I don't recall there being any specific targeting of agents other than, I think, the guy who was in charge of the Medellin office, that's one of the reasons they had to pull him out. And he makes the rounds. He's written a bunch of books, and he's been on a lot of shows and everything. And he was targeted, and he's got his stories and so forth. But I don't recall any specific targeting. Americans in general, it got to the point where if you were American, or if the company was American, whether it was the American School, Texaco Oil, IBM, the American Embassy, were targeted. You know, by 84, that was the level was stepping up because the State Department started considering it adult-only post. Anybody with kids was going to have to leave. In 84, March, April, early 84, Tranquilandia, the biggest lab seizure in the world, was seized, 12.5 tons of coke. And nobody knew it was there. It was in the jungle underneath the jungle canopy. And it was a kind of a neat operation. They had some transponders, some trackers, and some chemicals. It goes back to the chemicals. You can't have drugs without chemicals.
Yeah.
So the chemicals had a transponder, and they tracked it into the middle of the Amazon jungle. And nobody knew there was anything down there until the chemicals showed up. And then there was some other stuff, some other information, intelligence came in to kind of corroborate it. So we had the information of the Colombian cops, and they went out and raided it. And it turned out that the FARC, the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, the guerrilla group that was trying to overthrow the government, were actually protecting the cartel's cocaine investments, their cultivations and stuff. So when the raiding party went in, it turned into a firefight. What the traffickers would do is they'd have these 55-gallon drums from chemicals, and they'd put them on a landing strip. They'd have these little pistas they call, just a make-do landing strip for smaller craft and stuff. And they'd put them at each end so an airplane couldn't come in. And if they had a pilot coming in to pick up a load, there'd be radio contact, and they'd take them off so the guy could come in, pick up a load, go out, then they'd put these barrels on there. So when the cops came in, they had to come in with helicopters and land at each end of the pista to move the barrels, get the barrels so the fixed-wing aircraft, a Twin Otter, could come in with like 40 more cops and stuff like that. And that turned into, I wasn't on that initial raid. There was another guy in the office, Ron Pettingill, who was down there with him. And it turned into like a 2-day firefight. The guerrillas and the cops and everything before they got it secured. And then a couple of days later, I was sent down there, and we subsequently destroyed the whole thing, and it became a big deal. The testimony on the Hill and actually at State Department. But yeah, I mean, it was big time.
Was there a surprise at just how militarized they had kind of become? I mean, the FARC is kind of its own dynamic in itself, but, you know, the cartels in general too, compared to what we have for gangs up in the U.S. It's like...
The FARC was actually, I think they were designated terrorist organization. They've been in existence, I don't know how long, since before I ever got there. And the relationship, I think, evolved because initially, I don't believe that they were initially dealing, trafficking in cocaine. Subsequently, they were. They were running their own operations. So, everything changed, everything evolved, and I was only there for 2 years. I got evacuated because of our son, May of '85. But before that, they actually had me go up and testify here at State Department, the President's Commission on Organized Crime, and they had hearings specifically on the cocaine thing. I actually, if there's any reference you want to take a look at, I actually brought a copy of that book, the testimony.
I'll check it out. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it was a big deal, and that was in November of '84. And I think it was the 26th of November that year, another bomb blew up at the embassy. I was here in Washington, D.C., and Jenny was home. She was working in the embassy. They had an APO, a postal facility, in the basement. And the bomb blew up. It was a car bomb. And it killed, I think, one woman. They were always setting off bombs all over the place. There was one night where I think 11 car bombs went off within 5 minutes of each other, scattered all over Bogotá at different U.S. locations, the U.S. ambassador's residence.
So why were they trying? I mean, I don't even know how that would. You would think that would work, but were they trying to scare off the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is, the U.S. was pushing for extradition of Colombian drafters. Because it was, remember when Escobar was finally surrendered. And they let him build his own prison.
Yeah, we should probably lay the groundwork. It'd be some people might not, though, that are watching it. But can you maybe lay out who some of the key players were at that time? So Escobar.
Oh, yeah. You had Pablo
Ochoa.
Escobar was the major guy. I mean, the movies, books, everything written about him. He started out as a street criminal, and I think became one of the wealthiest guys in the world. Ultimately, there was a conflicting group, the Ochoa brothers. I forget all their names now. Fabio was one, but I think there were 3 brothers, the Ochoa brothers. There were some other ones. Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, I called him El Mexicano because he had a fixation for things Mexican, villas, stuff like that. But there was a group, but Escobar was the primary guy in Medellin, Colombia. And he built this cartel. They were moving tens of thousands of kilograms of cocaine into the United States. And during the 80s, that's when all the cocaine wars hit Miami. And the violence. I mean, they had shootouts, they had murders, they had all kinds of stuff going in Miami. But what happened was in Colombia, the U.S. ambassador came in, a guy named Louis Tams, had been a professor at Arizona State University. And he was a staunch conservative. He was a Reagan conservative. And he had been on the National Security Committee, I believe, but he was appointed the ambassador for Colombia. He was beating the drum regularly for extradition. He wanted Colombian citizens who had been charged in the United States for trafficking to be extradited for trial in the U.S. And that was, that was totally against what Escobar and these guys wanted to see, because they knew that if they got pulled out and wound up in the United States,
it's game over.
It was like later, I think he's still in Supermax in Colorado.
Yeah.
Underground someplace.
Yeah.
So,
One day,
that was another one.
Like.
Carlos later was another one, another associate. But yeah, so Tams convinced the Minister of Justice at the time, the Colombian Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, to go along with it. And they were supporting extradition. Lara Bonilla was assassinated in early '84. And it just escalated. And then Tranquilandia, was seized, and that really had blowback. Then everything got really, really nasty. I mean, bombing campaigns and assassinations. No Americans that I can remember. But man, they were going after everybody in the Colombian government, all the, judicial people, candidates, politicians, anybody passing laws or siding with the U.S. They were blowing up newspaper offices. El Tiempo was one of the main dailies down there. And they would run these articles when Tams, the U.S. ambassador, would talk about extradition. And they would report the government's position. And there was another one, El Espectador, I think it was. There were bombings. There were assassinations of reporters. Yeah, it was a nasty time.
When was Escobar and Medellin in general? When did they first really start getting on the radar of DEA and kind of, I guess,
before I got there?
Situation flip.
Yeah, I would guess the early 80s because at the time when I was in El Paso, we were doing shipments from South America. We had informants putting transponders in planes that were coming across the southern border. And I wasn't really involved or looking at Colombia specifically, personally. So I'm just guessing, early 80s.
Mm-hmm. And then one of the biggest aspects that is kind of romanticized in pop culture with, some of the series with Narcos and stuff is that there was kind of this jawing between the DEA and the CIA and some of the operations that were happening in South America at that time and where's funding going and this and that. So can you maybe speak to that a little bit too? And I guess like what the conversation felt like around that, especially when you're going down. I know there was the instance where Pablo and I believe Ochoa was captured on filmed with the Nicaraguan Marxist group, correct? And I know that really shifted gears. So can you maybe speak to that as well, whether that's maybe blown out of proportion or what that actually kind of felt like in the moment?
Okay, you have to keep in mind that at this point, I'm a working agent. Okay, I'm not at the hierarchy where I'm making decisions or seeing a lot of those decisions or policy interactions being made. I had the greatest respect for the agency guys that I worked with. I mean, we got along. We did things. I didn't know everything they did, obviously. They kind of rolled their eyes at some of the things I did. But, that operation, actually, it kind of dovetailed with the Nicaraguan Contra thing that involved an admiral on the national security team by the name of John Poindexter, and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. They had hearings and so forth because, the guns for the rebels in Nicaragua and all that kind of stuff. Well, at one point, apparently Escobar and other associates in the cartels had struck a deal with the Nicaraguan government to use Nicaragua as a transshipment point for cocaine. So there was an operation. They made a big movie of it, American Made or something like that, I think was the movie, where the informant Barry Seal was utilized to run a load in a transport plane, and they landed on a strip in Nicaragua. Well, we got pictures because, according to the story, and I'm not saying I knew personally or was involved with it or anything, but according to reports, DEA and the CIA had set up an operation where they had cameras in the plane. Now, I honestly don't know if Seal was working for the intelligence agencies. I know he was working at one time for DEA. So I don't know how that whole thing came about. But the bottom line is the photographs were taken of them in Nicaragua on the strip, meeting with Nicaraguan government officials. And those photographs were displayed during my testimony before the President's Commission on Organized Crime. They put them up on a whiteboard and asked me to identify Escobar et al. And, you know, it wasn't like I ever met the guy.
Yeah.
But,
Hope not.
I knew what he looked like. And
Yeah.
you know, so, yeah, but that was about the extent of my involvement in that. Everything else is what's been written, what's been videoed, you know, it's history.
Yeah, it's always a political chess match.
I can't address that. I can't talk to that.
Yeah. Well, so I guess one of the stories I do want to make sure I don't forget is your first interaction when you're going to dinner with I believe it's the architect, correct? For your first few days in Colombia, or first few weeks in Colombia.
Oh,
That story is too ridiculous to
yeah.
to-
Yeah, we when we first got down there, we were in a hotel for 30 days, temporary quarters, and then a real estate agent found us an apartment, found the apartment, so we're going to celebrate the apartment. She invited us over for dinner, gave us the address, like you gave me the address here, right? High-rise apartment building. And we go over there, and I go in, talk to the guy at the front desk. Okay, we're here to see so-and-so and apartment so-and-so. And I went up, we get in the elevator. This was Jenny and Tor and I, and my son. And we go to the apartment, the designated apartment, and I knocked on the door, and this guy answers the door, and I said, we're here for dinner. And of course, it goes back to my faulting Spanish. And the guy says, don't know anything about that. And he was obviously an employee. He was answering the door. He didn't live there. At least he wasn't the owner. So he had to stand in the foyer in the entryway. And he disappears. He comes back and comes, I don't think you're here for dinner. Nobody knows anything about it. I said, oh, yeah. You know, and I'm showing him the address and the name and everything. And it turned out that I was at Dos 1202, Dos o Dos. And I was supposed to be on Dos. I was on the 12th floor. I was supposed to be on the second floor. And, you know, so it turned out, we went back down to the second floor, found the apartment, had dinner, had a nice dinner. And later, in doing investigations, it turned out that the guy that owned the apartment was a drug dealer, a cocaine dealer in Pereira, when I had been down on that operation. And he had a big estate down there, but he kept an apartment in Bogotá. And I'd knocked on his front door and invited myself in for dinner and didn't even know who lived there.
I imagine on his end too. Can you imagine, like, they're having those conversations around, and he's talking with some of the other head kingpins, and they're just like, I don't know how they're onto us, but they're onto us. I had a DEA agent show up right to my door.
And hopefully they didn't know who I was either.
Yeah, that one blew my mind. Because again, it's just like the circumstances where you're saying there's just moments where, you know, it's like a higher power type of thing where it's just putting you in front of something where you look back and you're like, how is that even possible?
Yeah. And then the other shocker I had, you know, that was out in the Vichada, the eastern portion of Colombia. We were looking for opium at that time, opium cultivations. And we couldn't find him with the helicopters. And so a DEA plane came down out of Caracas, Venezuela. And I met them in a little port town, Puerto Camarena, you know, on the, I forget what the river was that separates Colombia and Venezuela. And these two guys come down. They're two DEA agents flying a DEA plane, and they land. I said, you got any problems down here? I mean, with traffic control, air traffic control and stuff? You're right on the Colombian-Venezuelan border. And these guys are really kind of nervous about the border. It's kind of like Pakistan and India, you know. They're just that head. And I said, no. But they said that the agent we're meeting would take care of it, Spanish speaker. And I go, whoa. That's on me. I'm supposed to negotiate some issue between the Colombian and Venezuelan air traffic controller guys to have an American plane down here. Nothing happened. It was, you know, we went back and forth and wove the area, no problems. Flew back to Caracas.
Yeah, man, that would, yeah. Oh, but that would have been. That's, I mean, today that's still like one of the biggest border hotspots too, because it never stops going on. I feel like anywhere in the world, but right now too, that's like already starting to kind of kick off because there's murmurs back and forth of that border kind of being. Yeah. So we're seeing Colombia really starting to reach those heights where, like you're saying, there's consistent car bombs, there's military operations happening. You know, you have all these different groups involved. And you start exploring to having to leave the country because it keeps leveling up in terms of, who's actually allowed to be staying there. What is your feeling at that time? Because it is a mixed emotion of course, family's priority. You want to make sure that they're, as safe as they can be, and you want to be able to kind of stay with them. Obviously, you don't want to have to send them home and you maintain. But, as you highlighted, when you first get in there and everything too, it's like, this is the real deal of real deals. Mm-hmm. So what was that battle in your mind like, knowing that you were looking to explore to leave?
Well, for me, it was time. It was time because I knew that there was a lot of pressure on my wife and there was a lot of issue with the family thing. And if the State Department was coming to the realization that it wasn't a place, for family, for dependents, because I didn't want to take a chance on splitting the family. I had a commitment from my wife that had amazed me to start with, so I didn't want to jeopardize that. Actually, I was looking for, we had the assistant administrator come down and talk to us personally about what we wanted to do. You want to stay overseas? You want to come back to the States? What do you want to do? And it was going to try to facilitate, what we wanted, those of us who were being evacuated. And at the time, there was a position open in Istanbul, Turkey. Turkey's right next to Bulgaria, or close to Bulgaria. Turkey is not next to Bulgaria, but Turkey was the DEA, the closest DEA office to Bulgaria. So I thought, if I could get to Turkey, at least I'm within shouting distance. So if something loosens up with the communists in Bulgaria, I might be able to get Jenny back over to see her folks and, have a reunion and stuff like that. So I lobbied the assistant administrator and one of the deputy administrator, but it didn't pan out. I mean, it didn't work. And, logically, DEA had a policy where you could only be overseas 6 years consecutively. And at that point, they wanted you back to a domestic assignment. And, then maybe, you could go back out at a later time. Well, I'd been in Colombia for 2 years. So the assistant administrator came back to me and he said, look, Turkish is a year-long language. Got to go to school for a year. You've only got 4 years left on your cap, your 6-year, max. So it's not feasible to even really consider sending you to Turkey. That's not going to happen. So they left, and bottom line is I kept looking for a job somewhere else. And then I had a guy from headquarters call me up and say, hey, not for nothing, but I got something for you in Pakistan if you're interested.
Yeah.
Pakistan. I didn't want to go there 3 years ago, 2 years ago. But the bottom line is we considered all the pros, cons, and what was going on, and we decided to go ahead and take a job in Lahore, Pakistan.
Do you ever look back on that? And again, this is something that I feel, I highlighted this in our original phone call. Situations like these, there's few that can ever understand in the world, and that's why it's so important to be able to, have your opportunities to tell your stories. Is there ever a feeling of, and regret's a harsh word, but of feeling like you missed out on the closure of that situation that was down there, that we saw that, working from, you saw how explosive, how dangerous, how violent it had gotten. And, you'd worked so many of these different cases and really looking to topple figures like Escobar. Is there ever been a level, I guess, feeling of maybe no closure on wanting to, finish out that mission, that objective?
No, I never have. There were so many capable agents and people in Colombia, Colombian police, DEA agents, intelligence service guys. I just felt the time had come for whatever reason that I'd done my time and something else was opening up. It's like that old saying, when one door closes, another opens. And I didn't feel that at the time per se because I wasn't all jumping up and down to go to Pakistan. But what we did, one of the justifications we used, we looked at the map. And we both love to travel. My wife had been essentially, after leaving her family behind, I mean, she wasn't adverse to traveling at all. I wanted to see the world. I never had the time to stop and visit when I was a sky marshal. I hit a bunch of places in Southeast Asia, but it was always just skip and go. So we looked at the map, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Malaysia, all these places were within a reasonable flying time of Pakistan. So we thought, well, okay, at least on the downtime for vacations, we can see the world while we're on that side of the world. Because we'd never go back from the States. We wouldn't be able to afford it or have the logistics or So it was kind of we justified going, but once I made the commitment, then it was, okay, Colombia is left to the guys handling Colombia. And I'm going to see what new frontiers open up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's kind of truly and again, I don't even know if I'm using the right word for maturity, whatever it might be, but I feel like you hear that time and time again where the mission or whatever the objective, people kind of get so caught into that everything else takes a back seat. Mm-hmm. And I think your life experiences up to that point kind of taught you that it's okay to close the book on one story and go to the next because, you had such a wonderful family and, as we've highlighted, wonderful wife, and you were kind of exactly where you wanted to be. So it was just curiosity out of that because, a lot of times I'm sure you have that with friends in the group as well.
I have some friends who couldn't let go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things before closing out Colombia, just because, again, it was crazy hearing the name pop up in the book because I was thinking about it when you were highlighting how much pressure DEA agents were under, is Kiki Camarena. So can you maybe highlight the moment there that you kind of had with him and then, his story and what kind of happened there?
Kiki, I never knew personally. I talked to him one time on the phone. I had an informant that was talking about the Colombians establishing routes through Mexico. And I called up Guadalajara, where Kiki Camarena was stationed at the time, and I happened to get him on the phone. It was just serendipity. And I talked to him about the informant. We had a conversation. I agreed to send the informant up to talk to him, give him the information, and see what might happen. Unfortunately, it was only a couple weeks later that Kiki was kidnapped by Mexican traffickers, subsequently tortured and murdered, and that was a heartache for the entire agency. It should have been for the entire country, and they still remember him. The Red Ribbon Day for Kiki Camarena is a national recognized event now. He was a DEA agent, and DEA vowed never to let the perpetrators escape, and so they've gone after him for years and years and years.
Yeah, we had Mexico.
And I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember all the names, because I didn't live that case. I wasn't on that case. I'm familiar with it. I didn't know him personally.
Yeah, I know it basically set the downfall for Felix Garrido and the Guadalajara cartel. But I know that one of the things that I've read from some other memoirs and stuff was that it did change the dynamic of how cartel groups would operate around DEA agents, because there was such a big reaction to that. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I know it was funny listening to the story, because you're highlighting all these bombs going off and everything, and I was like, man, I thought that there was they were a little bit more hesitant towards going towards agents. And then immediately when that name was kind of going through my head is right when that story popped up, because I was listening on the local version. I was like, well, that was weird. Like just the chances of it to tie together like that. But yeah, again, it's crazy. And it's like kind of a scene out of a movie where, it's another character, another story in there. And, you're having all this and it just kind of collides in that one point. So yeah, just wanted to make sure you kind of talked about that, because I think that's a very important moment.
Yeah, there was so much going on around the world that, very honestly, you could probably have somebody sit here who was an intelligence analyst or somebody toward the top of the pyramid who had collection and grasp of all the facts, or at least be able to give you an umbrella overview of how this impacted that and how this was related to something else. I can't, because as I indicated early on, I was involved in what I was doing, where I was at the time, at that point in time. And although I was aware of other things going on, I honestly didn't know a lot of the details. And I've kind of, well, suffice to say that I didn't know the details. I mean, for instance, when one of the colonels I was working with, the head of the narcotics unit in Colombia, a great guy, Jaime Ramirez, I was on raids with him. I mean, in the book, there's a thing about walking into a FARC camp with him. He was assassinated about a year after I left. I was in Pakistan, and Escobar assassinated him. And you look back, there was so much. It was so overwhelming. I didn't know about it until maybe, 2 or 3 days after it happened. I'm on the other side of the world. And the only way, it wasn't a lot of telephone communication at the time. And we get cables, we get teletypes, stuff like that. So there wasn't what we have today, this 24-hour, every second, everything's recorded worldwide.
News is on Twitter in 10 seconds.
Yeah. It was, and I'm not making excuses. I just didn't know about a lot of this stuff that was going on, and didn't have the wherewithal to, or reason, very honestly, to know, because I was doing what I was doing when I was doing where I was.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important that the reason I ask these type of questions with this as well is, it's part of the reason where a lot of times, again, we'll see it in pop culture, whatever it might be, and it seems like it's this super cohesive and everyone's this and everyone's in the know about this. And it's, as you highlight, you have operations, you have objectives, and you have jobs to do. And there's so much happening, all these different areas within the world, all these different operations that are taking place. It's impossible to know about everything. And it's like you'll have the situations that you know about. And it's always interesting to get perspectives on it. But like the general idea is that there's so many of these stories happening at once that sometimes we get so focused in on one that we forget there's so many others as well.
Yeah. And the thing is, you have to remember, that's what the bureaucrats at the top of the chain are paid for. They're supposed to be keeping track of all that stuff, and for whatever reason, getting their funding from Congress or whatever. But I mean, there are people in the organizations. That's their job.
Yeah.
Chief of operations or chief of intelligence or whatever it may be. But a grunt like me, come on. I'm down toward the bottom of the food chain.
But you're doing the important shit. They they get to look at some papers and be like, oh, well, not. There was so much more that went into that. Part of the reason I wanted to ask, like when Pablo Escobar even popped on the radar, is because I think when that show's timeline started was, I think it was like 1988. And it's like,
it's late 80s, early 90s, because I think, when did they get him? Like 92 or something like that. Steve Murphy, one of the guys, one of the characters, I'm in touch with him periodically. I never knew him. I never worked with him. He was in Miami or Orlando or someplace in Florida before he went down to Bogotá. And he and Pena, are credited with being the guys that got him. And that's well and good. But everybody was down there. By that time, I mean, they had the special forces down there. They had all kinds of resources. And when we were there, there'd be one gringo. It'd be me, or it'd be one of the other guys.
Hanging out on the truck, trying to stick with Spanish.
and trying to, get things done. So it was just a different environment.
Well, that's what I mean. Is like, again, so people watch that show and they're like, oh, this is a story. It's like, that's not the story. If it's the same thing with a lot of military operations. If you look at what's happening, somewhere in the Middle East, you pick something that's happened over the past 20 years, Battle of Fallujah, you'll see a movie on that and it'll be like, oh, it was like, no. That was a piece of that puzzle, but there was so much else that went around to that, both at the beginning, the intelligence, what happened at the end,
Exactly.
That it's important the timeline needs to get pieced together properly. And so, you know, like you're saying, some of the stuff that you might not know or not have been able to have experiences with, it just showcases is like, this isn't just one cohesive, you get to watch it on a blockbuster film. It's like all this stuff happens.
Yeah.
All kind of ties in and plays off each other.
It's a good point. Yeah, I mean, it's very true. Yeah.
So jumping to Pakistan.
Okay.
What was the feeling? You guys decided to head to the Middle East, and, you know, I could say it's about as different as you can get.
Yeah, it really was. We got there, and we stopped along the way. You know, we hit Bangkok. We hit all these places. Actually, we went to Taipei. Went to Nationalist China for a night. Yeah, I went because we ran into a guy in Bogotá that owned a Chinese restaurant that we enjoyed, and he was from there. And he said, well, if you're going to all these places, why don't you go to Taiwan? I said, why? He said, because I have a friend who's at the United Nations, a representative, and he'll take care of you. Okay, we'll do that. And it turned out that he had to be called back to the United Nations, so we were on our own.
Oh, boy.
But we even did that. We did Taiwan en route. So by the time we get to Pakistan, it's July. It was like July 10th, 11th, something like that. No jetway. Plane lands in Lahore, and the doors open, and it's like a blast. You talk about the Sahara Desert being, well, that's what it was like. It was this heat comes through the guy announced the temperature in Celsius, and I converted it. You know, it was like 120 Fahrenheit. And we thought, oh, my God. And we got down to the bottom of the stairs on the tarmac, looked around. Jenny looks at me and says, okay, it's been fun. Now can we go home? Yeah. And that was the introduction to Lahore, Pakistan.
I can't imagine going from Eastern Europe and knowing that type of weather. And then, Pakistan
it was
weather.
something. And they took us straight to a party, a welcoming party. The consulate was a small consulate general. And, you know, there were a dozen people, 15, 20 people, drinks and hors d'oeuvres. And I mean, we're wasted. I mean, we've been traveling.
Yeah.
And, you know, they finally decided that we should, you know, go get some sleep. They put us in the bedroom of another agent because I was put into a new position that had never been, it was just created when I went there. Because the State Department and DEA got together and the State Department wanted to increase its presence in Pakistan. So they were going to pay for the positions, support positions in Peshawar, which was on the Afghan border, Islamabad, the capital, Lahore in Punjab, and Karachi, the seaport down the southern part. DEA would provide the manpower, agents, and State Department would pay expenses. They'd pay housing, cars, program expenses, all this kind of stuff, to create a new task force, a drug task force. So I got tagged for Lahore, and my job was as the advisor to the Joint Narcotics Task Force for Punjab Province, Pakistan. I got there as one guy assigned to the task force, and I was supposed to build this thing up. It was kind of cool because I worked for the DEA guy, and my boss was DEA RAC, resident agent in charge. But I had my own budget because it was State Department. They paid for everything except my salary, and my time and attendance were kept by DEA. So it was kind of fun.
Why did Pakistan get so, or why did we throw it so important on the radar there? Because I feel like this is something that people, there's a big misconception.
Opium and heroin.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the opium cultivations in Afghanistan, see, at that point in time, the Soviets, I'm not saying Russians because it was still the Soviet Union, the Soviets were in Afghanistan, and they were fighting the war that, you know, we got sucked into. The British lost during the days of Rudyard Kipling. I mean, all this stuff. Nobody's really conquered or been able to defeat the Afghans. But the Soviets were in there, and they were producing opium. They were producing heroin from opium. They were growing opium poppies, cultivating the poppies to produce heroin to fund a lot of the activities, the anti-Soviet war effort in Afghanistan. So a lot of that stuff, obviously, you make it, you got to have a market. So a lot of it was coming to the United States. A lot of it was going to Western Europe. And, excuse me, so the State Department wanted to raise its level of participation. And DEA, jumped on board.
That's what I feel like. Yeah, because that happened when we were in Afghanistan, too. It was a massive market that was, coming especially to the U.S. And again, the misconception is all drugs come from South America. And, as you highlight, a lot of them come from, East Asia and, kind of that region. And honestly, some of the strongest in the world are from that region.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, see, at the time, a DEA had what they called a heroin signature program. And for heroin, there were 3 sources: Southeast Asia, which was essentially Burma, Thailand, that area; Southwest Asia, which was Afghanistan, Iran, maybe Turkey. Turkey had a large opium cultivation, so there could have been some overspill. And then Mexico. Mexico had black tar at the time. Southeast Asia had pure white. They had China white, number 4, all these different acronyms, names, nicknames for that. That was the best heroin. That was the 90+% that the GIs were getting addicted to. Southwest Asia and South Asia, it was not so good. It was maybe 30, 35, 40% at the outside. And primarily they would use opium. They'd smoke opium like the Chinese used to do years and years ago. But the heroin wasn't that good. It was like number 3, what they call number 3-step heroin. It was snorted more or smoked more than injected. The white heroin out of Southeast Asia was the injectable heroin. So this stuff, was up and coming, but they had a market for it. So over the years, they increased the quality. And that led to what I said earlier about when years later, I was in India, and they had good heroin coming out of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So by the time we went into Afghanistan, it was a lot higher quality than when I was first there in the 80s, in the mid-80s.
And you were saying that when you got there, too, you were surprised about, well, maybe not surprised, but it was pretty profound, the level of corruption that was there versus...
Yeah. It was. I made a comment one time to a friend of mine. I said, these guys could give the Colombians lessons on corruption, because the Colombians had corruption, but the thing is, it was kind of manageable, because a lot of the cops were related to traffickers and criminals and stuff like that. So you could kind of hopefully tailor make your classes, your investigations, to avoid conflicts of interest. So a cop may be 90% effective unless you targeted this other 10% where he may be related to him. Pakistan and South Asia, that's Southwest Asia. There's no formula as far as I could ever find out. It's just... What can I say?
It's corrupt. There's a few times that you're highlighting that where they'd give you a bus and then they would take the deal and then flip it and take the cash at the end and everything. And you're like,
that was one of the things we do, because the U.S., whether it was state or DEA, was looking for statistics. We wanted seizures. We wanted to show. State Department was big on eradication. They went into Colombia to eradicate the coca. They went into South Asia to eradicate the poppy, because they figure, okay, kill it at the source, but then what do you substitute it with? So if you got some dirt poor farmer out there that's growing some opium poppy, and the black marketeers are paying him more than he's going to make, in a year for his crop, and you got a State Department from the United States, and a guy coming in saying, well, we can grow substitute crops or whatever, we can teach you, that's going to give you 1% of what the bad guys are giving you? Economically, it's not going to work.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we would go out, work with the cops, and a lot of times I had informants. As long as I had a translator, because they never taught me Urdu, which is the official language, but as long as I had a translator, I could get informants and get drug loads. But then we'd get a seizure. You could get 100 kilos of heroin or 300 kilos of heroin or whatever. get it seized. The cops would seize it. We'd have our pictures taken. We'd get samples of the dope, send it back to the labs, and everybody's happy. Then the cops would turn around and sell it back to the traffickers, who would turn around and sell it to a new customer. And,
never ending chess match.
The cops got kudos because they'd get a pat on the back, or they'd get a reward. The informants would get paid. The U.S. government would get its statistic and its test. Wow, we seized 300 kilos at this percentage and yada, yada, yada. And then everything would go back the way it was.
You get to do it all over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let me ask a wrapping up question here, because this is probably one of the most interesting ones, is that all these cases circle around getting an informant. You need to find somebody that can help, give you the this and that to help you guys, work a case. What is your process, or what was your process for locking in an informant?
Lots of different ways. I mean, the simplest way usually in law enforcement is somebody who's arrested. Make them a deal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because you're not going to start at the top of the chain. So you're going to start at some low-level guy normally, and he gets it from somebody, who gets it from somebody, who gets it from somebody. So you work your way up the chain, and the first guy will inform on his supplier, who hopefully will inform on his supplier, and stuff like that. So that's the basic way to do it. Another way you can do it is surveillance. You set up. Everything is so electronic now.
Yeah.
A lot of the old stuff, I'm not even sure. I used to have guys that worked for me who rose into management with DEA. After I retired, they'd say, everybody wants to go up on a wire. Everybody wants to intercept phones and do all this kind of stuff. And they have, they've got everything from satellites to cameras, distant mounted cameras. We used to go out and physically sit in the car. I mean, this is old time, all right? We'd do surveillance, or we'd get on a warrant to do a telephone surveillance. We'd do all this kind of stuff. And you can develop friends or contacts or people who are disgruntled. There's all kinds of ways. You can befriend somebody, and they find out that you're a cop or you're an agent. And they'll say, I got something maybe you'd be interested in. And then you got the guys that walk in and say, I know something, and if you pay me enough, I'll give it to you.
Is it usually money that motivation, or violence?
Often. I can't say usually. In Colombia it was.
Mm-hmm.
And in Pakistan it was. It's different overseas than it is domestically, because domestically you've got the power, you've got the law. I mean, you can arrest somebody, or you can go to a prosecutor and convince them to make a deal, or suggest that they make a deal to, pursue the case. Overseas, my experience working overseas has been predominantly money. People come in and they want you to pay them for what they get. The other thing is competition. You got one organization that wants that street corner, but it's controlled by another organization. So all of a sudden, you got one drug dealer informing on another drug dealer.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to be very, very careful, because you don't want to facilitate what you're trying to disrupt by falling into one of those things where you're being used instead of using.
Escobar was notorious for that, right?
Yeah.
I remember there was a lot of times where he would
give
a little hint on where this guy might be.
And the other thing is other agencies can get involved too.
Mm-hmm.
You may get a tip from another agency. Maybe they're doing something completely different. Maybe it's domestically, it could be like somebody doing breaking and enterings. It could be maybe a bank robber. Maybe it could be an assault. And this guy has something he wants to give up on a drug dealer. So you get a phone call. And it's you're only limited by your imagination.
It's all a chess match, yeah. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on today. This was awesome. I'm sure it's not going to be the last podcast that we do.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. I'm starting to look at, the book winds up after Pakistan, and then I get a promotion. become a supervisor in Puerto Rico and then India and South Asia, go back to South Asia for 6 years. So I'm starting to put stuff together.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say is that I know we got that whole storyline as well. Didn't want to, we're coming up on time, so I wanted to be able to make sure we're respectful of that, but at some point we're going to have to get into that as well. But if you can give the book another shout out, again, all the links will be below and we'll have a picture pop up and everything. But if you want to give it another quick shout out, let people know where to find it.
Okay. Title is Busting Drug Dealers, Diaries of a DEA Special Agent. And the website is www.specialagentpress.com. Thank you very much, Guy.